Morning light crept across the barbed wire, turning the damp earth silver as the day struggled to rise. The camp was quiet in a way that felt unnatural, as if the air itself held its breath. Guards moved with slow discipline, their boots pressing steady patterns into the ground, while the women inside the compound gathered in tight, silent lines. Among them was a girl who kept her head lowered so sharply it seemed painful, her hands cupped against her face as though shielding something fragile or broken. She moved carefully, always keeping to the edges, making sure no one caught even a glimpse of her features. Her hair fell forward in tangled strands, and every time the breeze lifted them even slightly, she panicked, clutching harder at the sides of her face. She avoided the other prisoners just as fiercely as she avoided the guards, drifting like a shadow pressed flat against the fence. No one spoke to her. No one tried. Fear shaped every step she took. An American soldier on morning patrol slowed when he noticed her. He had seen women afraid, women defiant, women exhausted beyond expression. But this one carried a different kind of tension. It was not just fear of captivity. It was fear of being seen. He watched her from a distance, keeping his stance steady and professional, yet something in her movements pulled at him. Whenever footsteps approached, she shrank deeper behind her hands. Whenever a voice rose, she turned away as if the sound itself could expose her. The soldier looked toward the compound again, studying the rhythm of the group. Most of the women stood rigid but visible, their expressions hardened by surrender. Only she remained hidden, guarding her face with a desperation that seemed older than the day, older than the camp, older even than the war's final weeks. He felt a question rise, quiet but persistent. What was she trying so hard to hide? Across the wire, she shifted, retreating behind a post as though it might swallow her whole. The soldier exhaled slowly, the cold air tightening in his chest. Whatever truth lived behind her trembling hands had not surfaced yet, but he sensed it would matter. The camp settled into its morning rhythm with a heaviness that seemed to cling to every movement. Tin cups clattered softly during rations. Boots traced familiar paths around the perimeter. Orders were spoken in low, controlled tones. Yet inside the women's compound, silence remained the truest command. The prisoners kept close to one another, their eyes fixed on the ground, their shoulders tight as if bracing against something no one else could see. They moved through each task with rigid precision, refusing even the smallest exchange of words. The guards noticed it every day. Attempts at simple questions met stillness. Gestures of reassurance faded before they reached their mark. The women operated inside an invisible barrier, shaped long before surrender, built on warnings whispered over years of war. They had been taught that approaching an American meant danger. Speaking meant exposure. Trusting meant humiliation, so they communicated only through glances, brief nods, or subtle shifts in posture, as though any sound might trigger a punishment they still believed was coming. The American soldier who had watched the hidden-faced girl walked the fence again, studying the quiet shapes moving across the compound. His curiosity was cautious, almost reluctant, yet it lingered each time he passed them. He saw fear etched into their routine, a pattern of behavior too ingrained to break quickly. Their silence was not defiance. It was defense. Every gesture they made seemed driven by a belief that the war's threats had followed them here, unchanged. He paused when the girl slipped past with her hands still guarding her face. The silence around her deepened, tightening the space between them. The soldier felt the distance as more than physical. It was the weight of everything they had been taught about each other, meeting in a single, unspoken moment neither side knew how to cross. He walked the perimeter with the same measured steps each morning, but his attention drifted more often toward the women's compound than toward the fence he was meant to monitor. The American soldier kept his posture disciplined, hands steady on his gear. Yet his eyes followed the quiet figure who moved like a shadow among the others. The girl kept her face hidden behind her hands, lifting them only long enough to adjust the scarf of hair that fell over her cheeks. Even from a distance, he saw the tension in her shoulders, the way she flinched when anyone passed too near, as though proximity itself threatened to expose something she could not bear. He slowed when she crossed his line of sight again. She did not look up, not once, but he sensed her awareness of him. Every step she took seemed shaped by caution. When a guard's voice rose across the yard, she shrank back instantly, retreating toward the far fence with her hands pressed tighter against her skin. It was instinctive, not planned, an automatic dive into safety that told him more than any words could. He felt a quiet conflict rise within him. His duty was simple: observe, maintain order, keep distance. Compassion was not written into the routine. Yet each time he saw her reaction, something in him tightened. He wondered what belief had carved such fear into her movements. He wondered what she expected to happen if anyone saw her face. As he made another slow pass along the wire, he kept his gaze forward, pretending not to watch her slip behind a post. But he saw her, and the truth settled in him with a weight he did not expect. He was beginning to care, and he did not know if that was allowed. Whispers moved through the women's compound with the same rhythm each day, soft, quick, and shaped by years of warnings that had settled deep into their minds. They gathered in small clusters near the fence, speaking only when guards were far enough away, their voices barely more than breaths. The words were fragments of old teachings, echoes of rumors carried through streets and shelters long before surrender. They spoke of what they had been told Americans would do, how exposure meant shame, and how showing weakness meant losing what little dignity the war had left them. Some of the women clutched these beliefs tightly, repeating them as if repetition might keep them safe. They remembered propaganda pictures that painted foreign soldiers as cruel, waiting for a chance to strike. They remembered instructors who warned them that revealing themselves, especially their fears, injuries, or scars, would invite humiliation that could never be undone. These ideas had become part of their identity, shaping how they stood, how they moved, how they breathed inside the wire. The girl who hid her face stood at the center of the whispers without ever joining them. The others watched her with a mixture of sympathy and caution, unsure whether her silence protected them or only deepened their own fear. They understood enough to know she hid more than shyness. Myths had taught them that any visible mark, any sign of weakness, would be used against them. Her hidden face became a symbol of everything they feared: punishment, exposure, and the loss of control over their own story. Across the yard, the American soldier observed the groups forming and breaking. He could not hear their words, but he saw the tension in their posture, the way fear shaped their conversations. Whatever truth lived behind the rumors, it held them tightly. Steam drifted from the cookhouse as the sun rose higher, carrying a scent that cut gently through the camp's usual sharpness. The American cook worked with unhurried focus, stirring a pot of vegetables and broth that was far simpler than anything from home, yet warmer than anything the prisoners had been given in weeks. He moved with the calm discipline of a man who understood that small comforts mattered, even in places shaped by surrender. When he lifted the lid again, the aroma spread across the yard, creating a quiet shift that the guards noticed before the prisoners did. As the women lined up, the silence held, but its weight softened. Steam curled around their hands, and for the first time, their steps slowed not from fear, but from something close to curiosity. The food was plain, almost humble, yet it carried a warmth that blurred the sharp edges of the morning. It was enough to still their whispering, enough to make a few glance toward the cookhouse with expressions that were no longer guarded, only tired. The girl with the hidden face lingered at the back of the line. She hesitated as though stepping forward meant crossing a boundary she was not ready to face. Her fingers tightened along her cheeks, shielding whatever she feared others might see. Yet the smell of warm broth reached her too, settling around her like a quiet invitation. She took a single step, then another, moving with shallow breaths. The closer she came, the more her hands trembled, but she did not turn back. When she reached the front, the cook offered the bowl without a word. She paused, stunned by the simple gesture. Her hands remained near her face, but something in her posture eased. Just slightly, just enough to show the first hairline crack in the wall she carried around herself. Warmth, for a moment, replaced fear. She stood near the edge of the yard with her bowl held close, her hands still guarding her face, as if the warmth rising from the food might reveal her. The other women had already retreated to their corners, eating in the same heavy silence as always. But she remained frozen where she was. Her breath shook against her palms. Each tremble traveled through her shoulders, tightening her posture until she looked carved from fear itself. The calm of the meal had reached her, but it had not dissolved the warnings etched into her memory. Across the fence, the American soldier paused on his patrol. He saw her standing alone, saw the way her elbows pressed inward, as though she needed to hold herself together. For a moment, instinct told him to approach, to offer reassurance, but he stopped. He stepped quietly to the side instead, creating space rather than filling it. It was a small gesture, almost invisible, but she noticed. Her shoulders loosened by a fraction, as if the air around her had widened. She shifted her weight, uncertain. The steam rose softly between her hands. The breeze pressed against her hair, nudging a strand out of place. She caught it quickly, but her grip faltered. The trembling grew stronger, not from fear alone, but from the fragile pull of curiosity breaking through the surface. Slowly, so slowly it seemed the world had paused. Her hands lowered a single inch, then another. Her face remained mostly hidden, but the barrier was no longer unbroken. The soldier did not move. He kept his gaze steady, not sharp, simply present. She lifted her eyes by accident, just long enough for their gazes to meet. The moment lasted only a heartbeat, delicate and unplanned, before she looked away again. But it was enough to change something in the space between them, a quiet shift neither of them could name. When her hands slipped that small distance from her face, the change was barely noticeable to anyone else. But the soldier, still standing a few paces away, caught the brief shift of light against her skin. It revealed the faint outline of an injury, softened by distance, but unmistakable in shape. The marks were not fresh nor violent in appearance. They were quiet wounds, the kind left behind by fire, debris, or the collapsing world she had survived in the war's final weeks. He saw only a glimpse, but it held enough truth to anchor his breath. He did not let his expression change. Training kept his posture firm, yet it was something deeper that kept his face still. A simple respect for the weight she carried. He understood, in that suspended second, why she guarded herself with such desperation. Shame was not her weapon. It was her shield. And the scars she hid were tied to more than pain. They held the fear of becoming a spectacle, the fear of turning into the very image of weakness she had been taught to fear. His gaze lowered slightly, not in pity, but in acknowledgement. He shifted his stance, looking toward the yard rather than back at her, giving her the cover she needed to raise her hands again without feeling watched. The choice cost him nothing, yet it felt significant. Compassion, he realized, often lived in what one chose not to see. Inside him, conflict tightened. Duty told him to remain detached. Experience told him to observe only what mattered to security. But empathy had begun to settle into the spaces between those rules. He found himself thinking, not about her silence, but about everything she must have endured before bringing those scars into the open air. He stepped back from the fence, allowing the moment to close without pressure. She lifted her bowl and retreated toward the others, her hands once more hiding what little she had revealed. But he carried the glimpse with him, quiet and heavy, as he resumed his walk. He found her again, near the fence the following morning, standing alone with her hands pressed close to her face, as if bracing against a world that had never given her space to breathe. The air was colder than usual, carrying a sharp wind that tugged at her thin sleeves and lifted strands of her hair. She clutched them quickly, afraid they might reveal too much. The soldier paused several steps away, not wanting to startle her. He had watched her long enough to understand that even small movements could deepen her fear. He reached into his coat pocket, feeling the soft fabric he had folded there before dawn. It was a simple scarf, worn but clean, pulled from a supply crate rather than anything personal. He approached slowly, each step deliberate, making sure his boots struck the ground with a steady rhythm she could anticipate. When she noticed him, her posture tightened, and her fingers curled protectively along her cheeks. He did not speak. Words would have felt too sharp in a moment this fragile. Instead, he extended the scarf toward her, holding it gently between his hands. No command, no explanation, just an offering. She stared at it, bewildered. Her eyes widened, flickering between the fabric and the man who stood silently before her. The shock registered first, confusion at kindness from someone she had been taught to fear. Her hands trembled, not knowing whether accepting the gift would expose her or shield her. The wind lifted again, brushing the scarf's edge across her knuckles. She flinched, then slowly reached out. Her fingers closed around the fabric with careful hesitation, as if it might disappear if she touched it too firmly. She held it close, uncertain yet moved by a gesture she had never expected. The soldier stepped back without waiting for thanks, giving her room to breathe. Humility was the only language either of them needed. She stood near the fence with the scarf held carefully in her hands, its soft fabric resting against her fingers, as though it carried more warmth than the morning sun could offer. She had not yet wrapped it around her face. She only held it close, studying the folds with a quiet focus that seemed new to her. The other women watched from a distance, their own routines slowing as they sensed something subtle shifting in the air. Nothing dramatic, nothing spoken, just a stillness that felt different from their usual fear. The soldier passed on his patrol, keeping his steps measured. He did not look at her directly, though he felt her presence in the corner of his vision. When he reached the far edge of the yard, she lifted her head just enough for her voice to carry a single fragile word across the space between them. "Thank you." It was barely louder than a breath, a sound so soft it almost dissolved into the wind, yet it reached him. He paused, not turning, only letting the quiet acknowledgement settle. It was the first voice he had heard from that compound in days. Not a cry, not a warning, but a simple human offering. He continued walking, keeping his reaction small, letting her dignity remain untouched. The women nearby exchanged cautious glances. They had not expected speech from her, and hearing it cracked something open among them. One murmured a question to another. A reply followed, hushed but present. Soon small threads of conversation wove through the compound, light and uncertain, like grass moving after a long frost. Their voices did not rise, they barely lifted from whispering, but they existed. Guards along the perimeter noticed the change. No orders were given. No one intervened. They simply observed as the silence that had defined the compound loosened, replaced by a faint stir of life returning from somewhere deep. The scarf, still resting in the girl's hands, seemed to have carried more than warmth. She sat near the cookhouse that afternoon, the scarf wrapped loosely around her face, not to hide but to steady herself. The cook worked quietly nearby, chopping vegetables with the same calm rhythm that had softened the compound days before. The soldier approached with deliberate steps, stopping a respectful distance away. Neither pressed her for words. They simply waited, letting the stillness settle long enough for her courage to rise. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled, carrying more memory than sound. She told them she had not always hidden her face. Before the last weeks of the war, she had walked freely through her village, known by name, not by fear. Then the bombings came. Fire swept through the streets. A wall collapsed beside her, and heat carved itself into her skin before she could escape. The injury had not taken her life, but it had taken something she believed she could never recover. She touched the edge of the scarf as she continued. After the bombing, she avoided mirrors. Others avoided her. In shelters and camps, she learned to keep her face covered, not because anyone demanded it, but because judgment arrived before words did. She feared pity. She feared disgust. She feared becoming a reminder of everything the war had destroyed. Hiding became easier than being seen. Her voice wavered as she explained how surrender deepened the shame. She believed the Americans would see her injury as weakness, that they would mark her as less than the others, stripped not only of safety but of identity itself. The war had taken much from her, but the loss of herself, of who she once was, felt heavier than the scars. The cook nodded quietly. The soldier lowered his gaze. Neither offered explanations or comfort. They simply listened, allowing her story to exist without judgment. In the days that followed, the camp moved with a quieter rhythm, as if something beneath the surface had finally begun to loosen. The women still kept their distance, still carried the habits shaped by years of warnings, but the edge of their fear no longer defined every breath. The girl with the scarf walked with her hands lowered now, not fully revealed, yet no longer hiding as though the world might break her. The shift was small, but in a place built on silence. Small changes carried meaning. The soldier watched these moments unfold with a steady, reflective calm. He thought about the myths that had shaped the prisoners' expectations. Stories of cruelty, humiliation, and punishment passed down as truth. He had seen similar stories fed to soldiers on both sides, each designed to harden hearts and narrow understanding. Yet here, a simple act of kindness had done what warnings and orders never could. It had forced a crack through the wall built by fear, showing how fragile indoctrination became when met with quiet humanity. The cook, stirring another pot of broth, understood this as well. Food had bridged something no speech could. It offered dignity without demand, a reminder that even in the aftermath of violence, people could still care for one another in ways that restored a sense of self. He noticed how the girl held her bowl differently now. Not defensively, but with a faint steadiness that suggested she felt seen in a way that did not harm her. Around the compound, small gestures echoed this change: a whispered greeting, a shared glance, a moment of stillness that did not feel heavy. The truth that emerged was simple and unadorned. War had taught them to fear, to separate, to distrust. But it had failed to teach them the resilience of kindness, or how quickly humanity resurfaced when given a chance. The lessons they carried forward did not belong to one side or the other. They belonged to everyone who witnessed the quiet power of humility in a place built from loss. The scarf rested lightly against her skin as spring crept into the camp, its fabric worn, but carrying a warmth that stayed long after the mornings turned gentle. She no longer held it as a shield. Instead, she wore it the way one carries a memory, soft, quiet, and shaped by the moment it first bridged a distance she once believed impossible to cross. The gift had not erased her scars, but it had changed the meaning of being seen. It marked the beginning of a healing she never expected to find behind wire and watchtowers. The guards noticed how she walked with steadier steps. The women, once bound tightly by silence, and gathered without the same tension shadowing their movements. Even the cook and the soldier felt the shift, understanding that the scarf had become more than fabric. It was a reminder that small acts, offered without pride, without reward, could restore parts of a person the war had nearly taken. Across the broader sweep of the conflict, stories like hers rarely appeared in the records. Yet they lived quietly among the ruins, shaping how people rebuilt themselves after the smoke cleared. The war had left devastation across continents, separating nations, families, and identities. But in moments like this, moments born of humility rather than orders, it became clear that healing often began with gestures too ordinary for history books, yet powerful enough to outlast bitterness. As the girl stepped into the yard, the scarf moving gently with the wind, the camp seemed different. Not redeemed, not transformed, but softened by the truth her story carried. War had divided them. Humanity, offered in silence, had begun to mend what it could.